So Fujifilm, about those firmware updates. Hi everyone and welcome to Pal the Tech. Today we're talking about firmware updates from Fujifilm in general, or to better put it, what appears to be a decreasing number of updates for older cameras. For those of you that don't know, one of the long-standing traditions of owning a Fujifilm camera is that overall you can expect to receive firmware updates that continuously improve upon the camera itself. And by this, I don't mean bug fixes. I am talking about entirely new features that are added and rolled out to these older camera models. This is the concept known as Kaizen, which is loosely defined as a Japanese business philosophy of continuous improvement of working practices, personal efficiency, etc. Now, Kaizen has been a huge part of the Fujifilm culture, and it's an important part of the experience of owning a Fujifilm camera. Let me give you an example of this. In June of 2018, the Fujifilm X-T2 camera received firmware update 4.10. This update gave users of this camera new features such as enhanced phase detection autofocus, F-Log SD card recording, new 120p high-speed video, and various camera menu improvements. What makes this so noteworthy is that this firmware update with all of these new features came out in June of 2018. Yet in September of 2018, just several months later, Fujifilm released the X-T3. Even though they were gearing up for the "look, shiny new model," they still gave a nice set of new features to older X-T2 camera users. Or take the X-T30. Back in March of 2020, it was given firmware update version 1.0, which enhanced its autofocus and gave it better gimbal and drone support. But since that time, not quite as many Kaizen firmware updates have been released. There are still some of them, but overall, a lot less. Many of the firmware updates lately have been for lens support rollouts and bug fixes. And while we have seen new features for the X100V or the GFX line or the XS10, it just hasn't been the same level of Kaizen updates across many of their older camera models that matches what they used to do back in early years. I've seen discussions online that Fujifilm has been focusing their resources instead on developing new and faster processors. And by focusing on the newer cameras instead, Fujifilm will trickle down these improvements into older camera models. Perhaps. And I'd like to think that that's the reason for the Kaizen slowdown. But I do want to give you a few of my thoughts on this. By introducing this Kaizen philosophy of firmware updates, Fujifilm really put themselves in a difficult position. First, it's expensive to continuously fund these new updates to older cameras. And as Fuji continues to release new cameras, the number of firmware updates grows and exponentially becomes more expensive for them. With every new camera model that's released, they now have to support a whole slew of new firmware updates for that camera model. Second, you hear the argument that if you add enough new features to an older camera, you won't have as many users willing to upgrade to the newer cameras. Makes sense logically, right? I don't buy that. If you go back to the X-T2 update in 2018, even though this older model received a very significant update, sales just a few months later for the brand new X-T3 model did not appear to suffer at all. In fact, the X-T3 was a huge success. Lastly, Fujifilm set an expectation with their customers that Kaizen updates are part of how they support their products. It's part of an unspoken agreement. I buy a Fujifilm camera, and then, over time, Fujifilm will add new features and make it even better. Continuous improvement. Kaizen. And it is this last point that I think is the problem here. By cutting back on many of the featured firmware updates, Fujifilm is sort of breaking a deal that they had made with their users. They altered the deal.
I am altering the deal. Pray I don't alter it any further.
And all of this is not made easier by very limited communication from Fujifilm, both in their update plans as well as in the updates themselves. For example, software companies are always releasing software update roadmaps, showing the users what's being worked on and what's coming next. So how does this Kaizen problem, or perception of lack of Kaizen problem, actually get fixed? Well, both sides need to do better. Fujifilm, you need to recognize that you chose to go down the Kaizen track long ago. It was your idea, and it was your business decision that you implemented. It may not be as convenient for you now with all the camera models out there, but that doesn't mean you should be slowing down these Kaizen firmware updates. It may cost you extra money, but we'll get to that in just a second. On the flip side, there are photographers out there that also need to recognize that there are legitimate hardware restrictions that can prevent a number of these Kaizen feature updates. You cannot add a stacked sensor to a firmware update. A certain level of, autofocus improvements is not going to be coming to older cameras. Even the storage size of the firmware component file space itself on the camera can be a restriction. But regardless of all of this, I do think that there are some approaches that could be taken. Let's start with the updates themselves. Even with technology restrictions, there are many smaller improvements that Fujifilm could be bringing to older cameras, such as menu improvements, better shooting options, more custom modes, and so forth. And I think that these updates would go a long way toward making the users still feel like the company cares about and supports the cameras that they own. And yes, it's an investment on Fuji's part, but the goodwill and brand loyalty generated from doing this would make it very much worth it. I mentioned communication earlier. I'm going to mention it again because it is so important. Fujifilm needs to better communicate the roadmap of these future updates, what they are currently working on, as well as what the updates actually are and what they're doing. I think that that will help alleviate the perception that the older camera models are being abandoned. But getting down to the real issue here, money. It costs money to develop new features for older cameras and to deploy them with firmware updates. There's research, there's hiring more staff, there's increasing support. In other words, Kaizen costs money. So how do you solve that part of it? Well, interestingly, there is another approach Fujifilm could take regarding adding major new feature firmware updates to older cameras. And I'm going to show you an example and borrow from a company called Atomos. They make these external recordable monitors. These recordable monitors are about $500, and they allow you to record HDMI from your camera right into the monitor, and you get a variety of codecs and formats that can help you later on in post-production. But one of the big benefits you get in purchasing one of these are the various codec and video bitrate options on the actual monitor. Now, Atomos recently released several firmware update options, and one of them was a major firmware update where it actually added the ability for this monitor to record and generate out the H.265 codec, and you can have much less file size with that format. That was not part of the deal when I bought this. That wasn't part of this monitor. I didn't get it for that, but this is a great feature to have. So what did Atomos do about it? They actually sold the firmware update. It wasn't free. So if you wanted that big feature, you would go to their website, buy the firmware update file, grab it, put it in the monitor, and unlock the ability for this to do new features. You would pay for that, and those that needed those new features would be willing to pay for it, and those that didn't wouldn't have to. It wouldn't be part of it. They would still add bug fixes and all that other stuff, but the big ticket items, the big firmware updates, you would pay for those. Now, I am not suggesting that Fujifilm do that. I am not taking sides here in this debate, but I am going to ask you this question. I want you to think about it before you answer. Would you be willing to pay, say, I don't know, $75, $100, whatever, for a major autofocus firmware update for one of your older Fujifilm cameras, and so forth? In other words, have that option. Is that crazy? Is that something you think would be a good thing? Or should Fujifilm continue to roll out all of these improvements and updates for free of charge for older cameras and so forth? There's obviously no easy answer for this, but I would love to hear what you think about in the comments below this video. I do think that Kaizen needs to, again, again become a more prominent part of the Fujifilm camera experience. And we'll see what happens. Now we have the X-H2S out. We'll see what happens, what Fujifilm is going to be doing about this in the next year or so. In the meantime, that will wrap it up for today's video. I hope you found the video helpful or at least entertaining. And if you did, be sure to give it the like and subscribe. I will be back in a brand new video very soon. Take care.